everyone, and welcome to today's clip on Romanticism. This is the second part to the series about this concept, and this presentation is going to take a look at the ideas and characteristics as we see them through the text that we're going to study in class. Romanticism. You now know that the Romantic movement was all about a range of different events and ideas that included rebellion, and it was about being yourself, it was about being free to express your emotions, terror, anger, love, even passion. And it was about risk-taking and having great adventures and going on quests to wild and exotic places that no one would dare go before. And of course, Romanticism was all about challenging the rules and social expectations that were imposed by institutions like the government and the church during the Enlightenment period. The Romantics' rejection of all the things that were valued by those who lived during this period, such as science, reason, logic, and a clear social structure, were of course conveyed in their paintings, their poems, their music, and of course even their alternative lifestyle. This presentation is about the key characteristics that define the Romantic style, which we're of course going to be looking at in class. But before we begin, just a few things for you to remember. As always, keep a pen and paper at the ready so that you can take down detailed notes. You know that I'll be elaborating on some of the ideas that are appearing on screen in the presentation, and to help you, you can always pause and play the presentation as many times as you like. Your class notes and texts must be easily accessible, just in case you'll want to cross-reference or add to those notes. And of course, write in your own words. Doing this is going to help you later on when you're trying to develop your thesis statements and represent your understanding of the text that we've studied in light of the context. And if you have any questions, write them down and bring them into class, and of course we'll talk about them and discuss them further. So what are the characteristics of Romantic texts? Well, the list is not definitive, and it's important for you to understand that the Romantic movement really looks at a very different way of looking at the world compared to that of the classical movement of its time. You'll notice that many Romantic composers are concerned with very specific ideas which attempt to be conveyed in their works. Romantics were greatly concerned with human inspiration, and of course you're going to see that in the text that we study. And they were also really careful to convey their concerns with our potential to be deeply imaginative and naturally intuitive. And these challenged the regimented neoclassical ways of thinking, which were mostly based on logical thinking, using reason to come up with answers about the human being. The concept of individuality was also at the centre of Romantic tales and poems, and of course this challenged the idea of classic institutions. And of course paintings often depicted images that represented romantic notions of idealism, and often these paintings included idyllic and exotic landscapes and displayed acts of violence and revolution against political and church institutions, and even showcased elements of wild and supernatural encounters. So these are the characteristics we're going to take a look at in more detail. And I hope that it helps you to understand the text that we're going to be studying. So let's take a look at the first characteristic: inspiration. Now, unlike their classical adversaries who valued urban settings as centres of learning and culture, Romantics actually sought inspiration in natural settings. And this marked a major change in perspective about the relationship between man and nature, and as such, painters, poets, writers, and musicians looked towards the countryside as man's true setting, the place where the most profound experiences could be had with and amongst nature, free from artificial and socially constructed influences and restrictions. In Romantic texts, there was also a strong emphasis on the natural complexity of pastoral and sublime landscapes as powerful places of healing and revealing, understanding and fulfillment. Now, it was these pastoral settings which depicted rural, inhabited landscapes that were rustic, comfortable, and relatively tame, with shepherds and peasants. Sublime landscapes, on the other hand, depicted nature at its wildest, vast and powerful, inspiring terror and awe. Perhaps the most fascinating phenomenon to emerge from this was the growing interest in what's called the picturesque at the end of the 18th century, and this saw travellers falling in love with the terror and the wonder which they sought out in rugged landscapes such as glaciers, towering cataracts, and vast distant mountains. Caspar David Friedrich captured the importance of encountering nature in solitude within the most extreme settings as far away from urban civilization as possible, as seen here. This painting, called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, we see the traveller is positioned at the very summit of a mountain, and this offers him a sense of calm, and yet alienates him because it is so foreign to his perspective of the world. This point of view allows him to see the world from a very different place and get a sense of what it's like to be human within it. It was believed that physical and spiritual isolation was key to achieving self-awareness and connections with one's own emotions. And these were tainted by the usual political and economic noise of urban living, which were so common in the classical way of being. Foreign exotic places and ancient cultures were also sources of inspiration for Romantics, and we see these as features in many of their works, which featured elements of civilizations that no longer existed or were different in time or distance to those that the people at the time were used to. Now, these ranged between old and primitive cultures, medieval, Gothic, Oriental, mythical, and of course, otherworldly or supernatural. Romantic paintings, like that of Nicolas Poussin's landscape with Orpheus and Eurydice, as seen here, draw on pastoral settings and Greek mythology to depict natural human experience. And in this case, we see that it reveals that death is imminent and part of man's life cycle. Now, Romantic texts also reveal their composers to be inspired creators rather than technical masters. And that's because Romantic composers were deeply inspired by their interactions with their world, both immediate and distant. So it was these experiences that were really essential to fueling their sense of imagination and, of course, allowed them to be distinctively creative in their expression, as we'll see in Romantic texts. Another characteristic that we're going to look at and find in the texts that we read and explore is that of the imagination. And Romantics were typically recognised for being deeply imaginative in their way of thinking and in their creativity. They believed that the structures of urban life and politics limited the potential of one's imagination, and therefore fanciful interactions with the supernatural, bizarre, and nightmarish were actually commonly depicted in Romantic works, and most popularly seen in the Gothic fiction from the mid 18th century onwards. Now, this unconventional style of expression featured picturesque, haunted, and lonely settings, both good and evil taking centre stage. They also dealt with superstition and sinister characters such as witches, monsters, and supernatural beings. And this is a key feature, of course, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Romantic composers really challenged classical form by engaging the imagination in a really different and wildly fantastic way, telling these imaginative tales with complex storylines and multiple subplots that involve destruction, suffering, and death. And it's been said that such tales were actually designed to keep the reader awake at night. When you guys look at texts that are typically romantic, you'll find that the language explicitly reflects their intention to capture the distinctive images and feelings that they really wanted to explore and were concerned with. Early poems engaged with the simple everyday language of ordinary people. And this was often conversational and inquisitive in nature. So when you look at poems, you'll actually find that this style of writing was very common. However, in time, as literacy levels improved, the written word of Romantics became increasingly esoteric or deliberately difficult, as of course they try to preserve the complexity and intensity of feeling and creative integrity. They played with rhythm as well as qualities of sound and tone to evoke the seriousness of their subject matter, despite their use of wit and wordplay. And you'll find that the language in Romantic texts, particularly poems, is very experimental. They played with it and tried to do different things with words and expressions to try and create a distinctively imaginative and creative way of communicating ideas so that we too could feel and see what they wanted us to. Symbolism and religious imagery was also a feature, and this was used effectively to represent the individual's imagination and their imaginative internal world, which of course heavily contrasted their external reality. Now, in his major work titled Biographia Literaria, Coleridge sums up the significance of imagination by stating the following. He says, "Imagination is the soul that is everywhere. Imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception." And I guess from this we can see that for Romantics, the essence and the experience of being able to imagine was really at the core of their experience and their ability to shape an understanding of how they saw the world. Now, another characteristic that we'll see in romantic expression is that of intuition. Romanticism is really connected with one's intuition, has a close affinity with it, and certainly it celebrates the value that is placed on feelings and instinct over logic and reason. The strong contemplation of emotional experience, or as we might call it, the indulgence of the senses, was actually understood to be the key to understanding the nature of man and his existence in the world. Romantics questioned conventional views traditionally held by the classical establishment and emphasized the deep emotional impact that the world has on the human condition. Now, by exploring this spiritual, ethical, psychological, and political experience of man, the characteristics of reality and being human were given a deeper meaning, giving way to a unique sense of fulfillment. And this was something that the Romantics really attempted to engage with. Now, the celebration of physical sensations in all its extremes, good and bad, passion, terror, fear, and happiness, were of extreme importance also. Forms of literature and art often exuded an extremely powerful emotional expression, which the British romantic William Wordsworth described as, quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now, these images of spiritual realization, tranquility, lustful affairs between lovers, heartbreak, sacrifice, foreboding, suffering, and doom were actually popularly depicted in literature that was typically romantic. And again, much like imagination, it really was at the core of exploring man's sense of human experience. A focus on individuality is also a characteristic in romantic texts. Sometimes these are expressed in terms of revolution and defiance of social conventions, as we see here in this painting. Romantics really challenged the standards and the codes of classical thinking and living. And other romantics really conveyed this through exploration of self in plots of alienation, soul-searching, transformation, and of course destruction. So destruction was actually seen as a good thing. It was believed that destruction really made way for new beginnings. A rejection of the established institutions, such as the church and the monarchy, was also a feature. So this was very much in keeping with the celebration of the individual. It was thought that institutions stifled the natural state of man and his connection with the world. Typically, romantics rejected urban life as the centre of culture, and of course we're going to see a lot of these themes come through in romantic works. Historically, classical centres of civilization and philosophical thought were major cities such as Rome, Athens, and Alexandria. And romantics such as Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake were known to represent these cityscapes as places where one was actually vulnerable to personal destruction, moral corruption, and bound by ideological chains that enslaved them in a social system of rules and constraints. And so, in short, urban settings and established institutions really limited the individual. Now, this attitude fueled an ideological revolution at the time, which sought to explore and express the importance of individuality, personal spirit, wisdom, and understanding. And the intense yearning for personal rights and freedom of expression beyond the accepted norms also led to numerous significant political and social uprisings. So, of course, the focus on individuality wasn't just part of the Romantic movement, but it was a way of thinking that existed during this time. This painting here by Eugene Delacroix was called Liberty Leads the People, and it was painted in 1830. Now, this revolutionary spirit of the Romantics that I mentioned earlier and its focus on the individual is clearly evident in this painting. The bright red, white and blue colours that control this composition actually signify the intense passion felt by the revolutionists who felt it was their duty to fight for liberty and freedom. The spirit of rebellion against an inflexible institution which suppressed the people is captured vividly in the tone of freedom, victory and power of the workers that are depicted in this painting. It's clear that in keeping with the Romantic style, Delacroix has focused his painting on the people rather than the institution or traditional figures of authority. Liberty, as we see here, the heroine in the painting, is actually metaphorically depicted in a half-naked state, and this represents the natural power of all people, even women, who were traditionally not equal to men. This was really a challenge against the typical view of women at the time, who of course were seen as minors to men, and so putting a woman as the focus and the salient image within this painting, someone who is leading the people and giving her that sense of power, was very much something that was unorthodox during the Enlightenment period and challenged classical views and structures. The title Liberty Leading the People again further establishes the strength of and potential of all individuals, including women, to contribute to the making of an ideal society, free from the restrictive ideals endorsed by that classical model that we've discussed. Naturally, the painting includes other romantic features outlined previously in this presentation, such as the depiction and acknowledgement of suffering and death in the quest for freedom. There's also a focus on the destruction of the urban setting. As I mentioned earlier, this is very much celebrated by Mary Shelley. And the celebration of the feminine and human expression of strong emotion. And in this case, we see that the figures have facial expressions which represent this struggle and anger against the institution, and a sense of sacrifice for new beginnings, and of course a hope for victory. Idealism was also a key feature of Romantic works. Now, depictions of utopian communities set in natural environments were often celebrated by artists and writers, and these captured the yearning for a society that rejected anti-establishment structures and valued instead the contribution of the individual, which we've mentioned already. Elements of optimism and hope also shaped Romantic ideals. And we're going to see this come through again in the text that we study. And these Romantic ideals certainly included the emphasis on self-reflection introspection and emotional experiences being the very fuel that ignited awareness of self, spirit, and mind. Now, among many others, romantic ideals included the importance of carpe diem. You may have heard of this term before, and it really means living for the day, as opposed to focusing on the past or planning for the future. It also focused on, or rather, romantic ideals also focused on the innocence of childhood, and the memories of childhood experiences, the innocence that is associated with that. And these celebrated the sense of wonder in childhood experience and its value as a state of absolute, untainted, pure being. It's also worth noting that the acknowledgement given to the nature of the feminine was a key element in romantic texts. We notice in texts that are typically romantic that there is an appreciation of the female form, sensibility, strength, and influence. And like I said, these are very much often featured in romantic works. Male writers and poets who were romantic were often seen to express these feminine virtues of compassion and mercy and gentleness and sympathy, whilst others distinctly honoured the significance of women in society as mothers and nurturers of mankind. And of course, these were irrevocably connected to man. So without woman, there could be no man, and this was something that was very much celebrated and explored by romantic writers and poets. Now, these ideals were really seen as way too wild for the classical thinkers, and mostly considered impractical and unrealistic by classical standards. So all of these elements of idealism and individuality and inspiration were really a classic fail for the classic thinkers. Now that you're familiar with the characteristics of Romanticism, we're going to take a really quick look at how this concept is reflected specifically through language in texts. So in your study of Romantic writers, you'll have the opportunity to have a look at how perspectives and ideas which have been influenced by the Romantic context have been communicated. And it's important for us to really ask the following question: what are the features that make Romantic texts so unique? Well, to answer that question, it's important for us to take a look at their language, and some of these things I've already talked about. So here is just a quick overview of some of those features in brief. We've talked about everyday language being used in romantic texts. The ability to communicate with the ordinary man was very much central to Romanticism and the message of Romantics, as was the initial need to share extraordinary ideas with a wide audience. But as I've mentioned earlier, as more and more people were able to read, the complexity of text also began to change. And poetry in particular saw a change in language use, in which it offered a specialized language known as a poetic diction. So it did become increasingly difficult, or as we call it, esoteric. And this language became more common as it was thought to better capture the intense expressions of feelings and imaginative thoughts. Another feature of romantic expression in texts was that text generally evoked a deep sense of emotional expression of the writer, and often these reflected the feelings and thoughts of the writer through the eyes of their adopted characters. And the use of complex imagery and symbolism allowed writers to convey these complex ideas and feelings in an effective way. This language also enabled a vivid insight to issues of emotional significance relating to one's internal world of the imagination or their external reality. Naturally wild settings were also features of Romantic works, including imagined places, rural landscapes, and sometimes exotic and faraway locations that were foreign to ordinary people at the time. And as I've mentioned, I've already covered some of these elements earlier in the presentation. Romantic composers might also include in their writing qualities of innocence and wonder. Their expressions may be childlike or express childlike experiences of adventure and quests and discovery, and an extreme feeling as if discovered for the first time, as if a child was, feeling something for the first time, that sense of curiosity and experience. So often their texts reflect childlike fantasy and expression. Another feature that we'll see in texts is this focus on individuality, which I've already mentioned, and the exploration and expression of self also being a common feature. Often this is conveyed in terms of rebellion against conventional ideas and institutions, and of course the celebration of distinctively antisocial, destructive plots and scenes. Now, many of these texts that we're going to look at deal with the experience and essence of man, emphasizing spiritual, ethical, psychological and political inquiry, which of course challenged the established views of the time. And often this is done through direct statements or tentative question. Now, in short, to wrap up, Romanticism is really a complex concept, and it includes a number of distinctive features which I have covered in this presentation. Understanding this context and the ideas and thinking which gave way to seeing the world in which the Romantics did really offers you an insight into the characteristics of Romantic texts, and hopefully will allow you to study and respond to your prescribed texts in a more informed and critical way. So here are some things for you to remember when you are looking at those studied texts. Romanticism looks at antithesis of classicism. It focuses on the imagination, the individual, looking at things in an innovative way and subjective experience. It focuses on nature as a focus of experience, both mystical and sublime. It focuses on individual self and self-analysis, and of course the importance of emotions. It looks at the human energy and how we change and how it's improbable and visionary and chaotic and sometimes even supernatural. And it really does focus on humanity, childhood, primitive societies and structured societies as being corrupting influences. Romanticism, of course, also looks at freedom of expression and spirit, but it celebrates what we refer to as the Gothic, grotesque, destruction, violence, decay, and the supernatural. In Romanticism, of course, we see the poet or the writer as the hero or the heroine, in that they find wisdom and understanding through their isolation and alienation and through other negative experiences. And lastly, when you look at the way that these ideas are expressed, we see that it's very much in everyday language, which became esoteric, but it strives to maintain a sense of clarity and individual style. So that wraps up our presentation. I hope that you found it useful, and try to keep it in mind when you look at your texts. Feel free to do some of your own research and to think about how the texts that we've studied fit in to your understanding, because of course the more reading you do, the more understanding you'll gain, and it'll give you an opportunity to respond in a more informed and critical way. Here is a here's a list of the texts that I use for my research, but of course you're most welcome to do your own research in the future. But for now, thanks for watching, and have a great week.